Good afternoon, dear students, colleagues, marvelous CETRA organizers, and especially also our esteemed CETRA chair for this year, Professor Kobus Marij. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Professor Geert Brone, Vice Dean of Research Policy at the Faculty of Arts, KU Leuven, and myself, Head of the Translation Studies Department, or Research Unit, if you wish, to this year's CITRA Summer School on Translation Studies. We are delighted that you are joining us for the 36th edition of this summer school from across the world, mainly online this year, so hi everybody. As you maybe can see, you don't have cameras, but we are a few people, a bunch of people. We are like 20 people here in the room, mainly staff. We are live here in Antwerp to welcome Professor Marij, who has come all the way from South Africa. The alternation between online and in-person editions makes the CETRA Summer School unique and both inclusive and ecological. It's more inclusive as not everyone has the opportunity to travel or to be away from home for 2 weeks. It's also more ecological as it reduces the need for air travel. While social interaction is naturally more limited in the online format, this approach allows broader participation and contributes to sustainability. We are convinced that you are in for a treat in the upcoming 2 weeks with a program that allows you to share your research ideas with peers and experts in the field. Engage in discussions on theories, methods, applications, the future of the field, and more. You can pick the brain of renowned international scholars and enjoy the lecture series by the CETRA professor. We therefore are truly honored to welcome Professor Kobus Marij to the CETRA Summer School. As a leading voice in translation studies, his pioneering work spanning complexity theory, semiotics, biosemiotics, and development studies, and so much more, has profoundly shaped the field. His lecture series on the complexity of translation promises to be a highlight of this year's program, offering deep insights into the evolving nature of translation. We are excited to learn from his visionary thinking and engage in meaningful dialogue that will no doubt leave a lasting impact on all participants. It is hard to imagine a better training ground for early career researchers than this summer school, which offers a truly immersive experience that goes beyond training. For many who have participated in the past, this summer school has been a platform for professional and personal connections, marking the start of sustainable collaborations and friendships. And with such an impressively rich tradition, 36th edition of the summer school, this event has, beyond any doubt, had a massive impact on early career translation studies scholars from around the globe, and thus on the development of the field as a whole. By participating in the summer school as its 36th cohort, you are contributing to this development of the field, not only by getting familiar with the state of the arts, but importantly also by sharing your own research endeavors that undoubtedly will shape the future of translation studies. And this field will definitely develop substantially in the years to come, given the rapid technological changes that affect both research and professional practice. All the more reason, one could say, to continue to provide a platform such as the CITRA Summer School, and for you to reflect on three important elements: crucial skills and tools; secondly, to map your professional future self; and third, to engage in interdisciplinary dialogue. For a field such as translation studies, which is positioned at the intersection of languages, cultures, disciplines, and technologies, each of these three dimensions is key. And based on the program, we are confident that the summer school will help you navigate your way through each of these in an intellectually stimulating and professionally enriching environment that will surely be personally transformative. Let us briefly zoom in on each of the three aspects just discussed. To begin with skills training. Like many other disciplines, translation studies, in its different manifestations, is witnessing a rapid development. Rapid development of methods and tools for data collection and analysis, and so on. And it will fundamentally reshape the field. At this point, we don't want to dive too deep into the debate on the transformative power of Gen AI for research and practice. We are sure you're all very much aware of this, but it is an obvious and crucial task to train future generations to acquire new digital literacy skills. The workshops, peer-to-peer activities, and lectures provide you with an ideal opportunity to share, practice, and reflect on skills of all kinds, digital literacy skills and others, helping you to build your future-proof professional profile. This brings us to the second aspect, developing your professional future self. In other words, this summer school is all about you, not just who you are now, but who you are becoming. Although this summer school obviously focuses on translation studies and the skills and values required to conduct high quality research, we would like to encourage you to seize the opportunity to experiment together with other participants with your professional identity and ask yourself what values will guide your work in the future. What defines success in your field, both intellectually and ethically? Finally, we want to point out another cornerstone of translation studies that is strongly reflected in the program of the summer school, and that is its interdisciplinarity. Needless to say, translation studies have never been a discipline that operates in isolation. It's informed by insights from linguistics, literature studies, philosophy, history, computer science, political theory, sociology, media studies, and so on. And it gives back to all of them. This is a strength, not a weakness. Here at KU Leuven, we strongly believe in this strength, which is reflected, among others, in the newly established Lilly Leuven Interdisciplinary Language Institute, which unites language researchers across a broad range of disciplines, from communication science, linguistics, literature studies, and psychology, to law and criminology, engineering, healthcare, and speech therapy. Translation studies scholars are strongly represented in this institute, showing their firm commitment to interdisciplinary interaction. During the summer school, you will most likely encounter lectures and engage in discussions that push you outside your academic comfort zone as well, going from, just to give an example, post-colonial literature to sign language interpreting. Embrace the possibility to engage in this dialogue between different subdomains of knowledge within the interdisciplinary field of translation studies. And even if we are only at the start of the CITRA summer school, allow us to thank now already two people who are the driving forces behind the whole organization, Steven de Wallis and the director of CITRA, Jack McMartin. In closing, let us remind you of one more thing. The summer school is not just a series of lectures and workshops. It's a community, even if only for a short time. Make the most of that. Engage with your peers, challenge your teachers, question assumptions, share your insights. These connections and conversations are just as valuable as any lecture you will attend. And now we will be really closing, not without saying welcome to the CITRA staff members who are part of this community. Welcome to CITRA Professor Marais, whose presence elevates this community. Welcome to you all. We look forward to learning with you. And now I have the distinct honor of declaring the 36th CITRA Summer School open. Thank you.
Thank you, Hedy and Geert, for the lovely opening. We are now officially open, so I get to take the floor now. Welcome to our participants, all 21 of you, representing 14 countries and at least twice as many languages. This year's application process was as competitive as ever, and the fact that you're here, that you've secured a place in this summer school in this special community, um, is a testament to your work already. So congratulations on being here. It's my turn also to welcome everyone. Welcome first and foremost to our members, of course, our newest members of the CETRA community, our participants, but also to our distinguished chair, Professor Cobus Maré, who joins us, as we've heard, all the way from Bloemfontein, South Africa, and who has already been introduced, but I will also elaborate a little bit about our chair professor's profile. Welcome to our international teaching staff here in the room. There's quite a turnout. Thank you for coming, and also online. In total, we have 30 members of staff who are contributing to this year's summer school in various ways. Thank you for your contributions and for making the summer school possible. My name is Jack McMartin, Professor Doctor, but you can call me Jack from now on, please. It's been a pleasure to plan the summer school. This is my third CETRA summer school since becoming director in 2022. And it's my fourth summer school in total. And it's still a pretty magical thing. And you can already feel the energy in the air. I felt it this morning at our briefing. The first time I participated in CETRA was 10 years ago in 2015. And as I mentioned, it was quite electric. I remember the electricity, I recognized it here, and it was exciting to share air. It still is exciting to share air with so many translation studies researchers, people whom I've read before, but I never really imagined as flesh and blood, actual human beings. And then, as you'll see, you get the opportunity to engage with these people and also call them colleagues and be considered a colleague in return. And that's an exhilarating experience that I hope you're all looking forward to. I was quite nervous then as a participant, still a little bit nervous now, perhaps. But once we get into the flow of the summer school, once the CETRA effect kicks in, then it becomes a transformative experience. And you find inspiration and support and guidance in your research. And in return, you also find kindred spirits, a challenge or two, perhaps, but most importantly, a place in our research community. And so you're in the right place. I knew I was in the right place at that time. And now for the third time, I have the privilege of helping to create that place for you as one of the organizers of the summer school. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Steve de Wallace, our administrative coordinator, for all the work that he does also every year to make the summer school possible. More than any other, so these are the big words, which we could qualify, but more than any other tradition in our discipline, CETRA has been both a crucible and a safe haven for doctoral researchers and postdoctoral researchers, a rite of passage, a place to hone your skills and test your chops, and above all, a place that fosters a sense of belonging. And that's what I want to convey when I say welcome, when I say welcome to CETRA. So welcome to CETRA. If these remarks so far sound overly sentimental or overly optimistic or too forthcoming, in short, a bit too American, it's not ChatGPT talking, it's really, truly me. And it's also because I'm excited. I'm excited to finally meet the CETRA class of 2025, whose members are doing important work across all domains of translation and interpreting research. Just to give you a sense of the breadth of domains represented, you can look at the titles of the thematic panels that we'll have in the second week of CETRA, which include post-colonial alliances and translation, gender, taboo, and translational ethics, interpreting practices and emerging technologies, audiovisual translation and multimodal mediation, translating self and other, power, place, and translation, and translation, politics, and the digital sphere. And how can you not be excited about a program like that. I'm also excited to welcome the distinguished international teaching staff, etc. As I mentioned, 30 distinguished colleagues from around the world who are generous enough to share their expertise and their knowledge with you. So take advantage, as Hedy said, of that opportunity. You'll encounter them in all different formats. We went over the different formats this morning together, but you'll meet them in Q&As and workshops and tutorials over the next 2 weeks. They'll also be present, many of them, for the presentations. It's fair to say, I think, that we've assembled a dream team of translation studies researchers here with hundreds of years of experience, teaching and life experience also among them. So thank you again for all you do, staff members, to make the summer school possible. We have 2 new staff members this year, and so I'd like to single them out. Of course, your colleagues will introduce themselves when you encounter them at the various settings, but we have 2 new staff members, Regina Rogel and Philippe Hoffenneder. Thank you for joining staff, and we're really excited to learn from you. Thank you also to the past directors of CETRA, many of whom are here today. And Jose, I think you're online, I'm not sure, but anyway, he sent his regards, Kovis, in the mail this morning. Also to the participants. Jose Lambert is our founder and our honorary chair. Reine Melaerts is here. Luc van Doorselaar are both here in the room, and Peter Bologna sends his regards from Paris, where I read he's having a wonderful time. So those are the former directors, obviously big shoes to fill. Today is the opening, the academic opening session of the summer school. We're coming to you live from CETRA's new home in Antwerp, Campus Opera. It turns out that it wasn't easy to find a name for this campus. It's a beautiful campus, as you can see. I lobbied for CETRA House, which wasn't accepted. Its official address is in the Jezusstraat, so Dutch for Jesus Street. And then if you know the history of this university, it's a Catholic affiliated university, but the ties to the Catholic Church are clearly not strong enough to go with Campus Jesus. So we finally settled on opera. Which it's true that Antwerp's Opera House is around the corner here, and that may have been some of the inspiration, but opera obviously has a deeper meaning and one that transcends this particular place. It's detached from where we are now, and it's connected to you, and I'll explain. The word opera comes from Latin and later enters Italian, a noun for the verb operari, to work. And both the result of work and the labor itself are encapsulated in the word. It's also the plural of opus. So a fitting name for not only this campus, but also for what we're here to do. We may be tuning in from behind screens across the globe, but we are all working together. We're laboring together. And so welcome to Campus Opera. I also want to take a moment to highlight some of CETRA's other activities. Our core business has always been the summer school, but we are also an active international research center, and there's a lot going on at CETRA at any given point in the year. The CETRA lecture series is an example, and we also run a book series, Translation, Interpreting, and Mediation, published by Leuven University Press. We had a few lectures this year. The last one was in fall 2024, given by the sociologist. If you could please mute your microphones. Thank you. So our fall lecture was given by Tristan Leperlier of the French National Center for Scientific Research. His talk was on the plurilingual local at large, which doubled as a keynote for the International Conference Book Translation in Multilingual States, organized by CETRA's board member, Elke Brems, who's also here present. And there will be an edited volume of papers, selected papers from that series or from that conference published in our book series. You can see everything's connected. On Thursday, November 13th, you can mark it in your calendar. Cetra will welcome another sociologist, Peggy Levitt, for the first lecture in our 2025 series, and she'll speak about ways to center core periphery thinking in translation studies and in the social sciences at large. And she'll be dialoguing with Johan Helberol, who is, of course, one of the proponents behind center periphery thinking. So that should be quite interesting. Center periphery thinking being decentered in the presence of one of its proponents. So that's on the 13th of November. In the book series, we have several wonderful books that are in development. The latest, the one that is currently in production is Affect in Translation and Interpreting, which grew out of the 2023 Cetra Summer School and is inspired by the pioneering work of that year's Cetra Chair Professor, Kaisa Koskinen. And she's also contributing to the volume. She wrote the coda for that book, and many members of that cohort participated in the volume. In fact, it's guest edited by 3 Cetra alumni from that year, Elizabeth Boumans, Lucy Spezzati, and Sofia Monson Rodriguez. We also plan an edited volume for this summer school, and we'll have more information about that at the Q&A next Thursday. And with that said, it's a pleasure now to finally... Ja, kan zijn dat ik wel op zijn max had willen Is it relevant? Don't recognize who that was. I'm not sure who that was. Yeah. Okay, and so with all of that said, it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce our 2025 Cetra Chair Professor Cobus Marij. The role of Cetra Chair Professor is reserved for distinguished colleagues whose research and teaching the board considers excellent in practice, broad in scope, and forward-looking in vision. Those are the words in the actual minutes. We are so glad that you accepted this appointment. Thank you for being here, and we're grateful also that you're able to join us in person here in Antwerp. Professor Marij is an internationally recognized voice in translation studies whose work has consistently expanded the boundaries of our field, and his research approaches translation through the lenses of semiotics, biosemiotics, complexity theory, and development studies, as we've already heard. He invites us to see translation not only as an interlingual practice, but as a key process in the very emergence of social and cultural reality. He's the author of many different materials, many of which you'll have the opportunity to read in preparation for the lecture series, but 3 influential monographs: Translation Theory and Development Studies, a Complexity Theory Approach; A Biosemiotic Theory of Translation, the Emergence of Social Cultural Reality; and most recently, Trajectories of Translation, the Thermodynamics of Semiosis, from 2023. He's also edited Translation Beyond Translation Studies and co-edited volumes with Ilse Veenauer and Rene Meelaerts, including Translation Studies Beyond the Post-Colony, Complexity Thinking in Translation Studies, Methodological Considerations, Exploring the Implications of Complexity Thinking for Translation Studies, the Routledge Handbook of Translation Theory and Concepts, and the Complexity of Social Cultural Emergence, Biosemiotics, Semiotics, and Translation Studies. And if we can get just a filter and a fragment of the wisdom and thought that are captured in those books, then we'll be grateful and better off for it. So this impressive body of work testifies to a career-long commitment to building conceptual bridges between translation studies and other disciplines while fostering dialogue across scholarly traditions and regions of the world. We're fortunate, truly fortunate, to welcome Professor Marij as our 2025 chair professor. And over the next 2 weeks, he will share his insights in lectures, in tutorials, and discussions. And I have no doubt that his contribution will spark the kind of lively, critical, and constructive debate that defines Cetra. Today, Cobus delivers the first of 5 chair lectures, all of which carry the overarching title, The Complexity of Translation, as Heidi mentioned. And now we will hear The Complexity of Translation, the Stuffs that Get Translated. Cobus, the floor is yours.
Um, Thank you very much, colleagues. Firstly, Professor Salatz and Brunner for the welcome and the introduction. Professor McMartin for the kind introduction, and the CETRA board for trusting me to be here. I don't take that trust lightly, and I hope that I will be able to honor that trust. I would also like to welcome the students. I don't know you yet. I've read the proposals that you have submitted, but I hope to get to know you and to engage with you through the 2 weeks. I assume that we will have differences of opinion, and I would love to engage you on those. I'm not saying what I'm saying here because I necessarily believe it's true. Some of it is exploratory, and so it's all open for engagement. So I would love to hear your questions. I would like also to thank a few people who have been important in my academic journey and development. Rainer Meilaerts, for one, who has worked with me and helped me understand many things. Thank you very much for the contribution and the insights. I want to acknowledge my colleagues back home, Unapula Molefe, Marley van Rooyen, and Zaini Jansen van Vuren. We also have some linguistics colleagues, but they sort of not in this line of work. For on a daily basis, engaging, moving ideas forward. And then also Jackie and Cynthia Miller-Nudea. Jackie I've known since 1983. We've been, he's been a mentor for me since way back then, so I acknowledge his work. And then also other colleagues that I've engaged through, many of you here. It does indeed take a village to raise a kid. So thank you very much for that. I acknowledge that I've been raised by a global village. Whether I'm grown up yet, I mean, that's for you to decide. Okay, so the instruction I got, I just quickly want to set my timer. The instruction I got from Professor McMartin for today was to talk about generally giving an introduction as to what I think translation might entail, what the field might be like. And it is a hard task that he gave me. And let's see if we can make some headway with that. So I think to this day and throughout the history of translation studies, there have been many questions that we can ask about translation. One of the core ones would be, so what do we translate? We could obviously also ask it from a different angle. If you take the literal meaning of the etymology of translate, what is carried over when we translate? Or if you want to go for a more hermeneutic approach, what is created? What do we create, or what do we recreate when we translate? And that's what I mean by the stuffs. What is it that we are dealing with when we translate? We could put it in the words, what are we doing? So not only the stuff, but the work that we are doing on that stuff. What is that about, and what are those? So in a recent book, Piotr Blumczynski has made the argument that translation, as used in translation studies, is a metaphor. Translation, the word translation originally meant just physically carrying something, and it's been taken over as a metaphor in translation studies. Other and he argues this in contrast to what is sort of popular in translation studies, that cultural translation is a metaphor and translation is the real thing. So I think we need to clarify what the term translation means for translation studies, because in a field of study, I think as much as you can start off with working with metaphors and growing metaphors, somehow you need to come to some kind of understanding what that means, and make it more substantial than a metaphor. So what I think translation is, and I'm going to spend the week trying to, the 2 weeks trying to engage you on this. So you don't need to worry for now. I'm just going to state it here, and then we'll work it out as time goes on. I think translation is semiotic work that we do, and I call it negentropic, in the sense that we are doing it to create new things, that we do to constrain and to interpret constraints on semiotic material. So we constrain semiotic material, we interpret those constraints, and all of that under the auspices of some kind of teleology, some kind of goal that we want to achieve with that process. Right. So still the question is, what do we do when we translate? I initially thought that what we... There seems to be a spirited meeting there. A meeting, there are all kinds of spirits talking from everywhere. Right, so what is the stuff that gets translated? Initially, I thought it important to say that the way in which we look at this stuff, the epistemology that we use for this stuff, use for studying this stuff is important. And that's why I went to complexity theory since about 2009. If you're interested, I can tell you the story of how it started with drunken students, but I'm not going to waste your time on that now. So at that point, I thought there were quite a few binaries in translation studies, like source and target, universalism, particularism. We have the types of translation, documentary, instrumental, etc., and probably many others. And complexity would be, complexity theory would be a way to address these binaries, would give us a conceptual framework to think broader than in terms of these binaries. So the CAS stands for complex adaptive systems. That's a sort of a general acronym for complexity thinking that I'm just here using. So, for instance, one of the things that I think complexity thinking helped me with is to understand translation as a process, but it's a complex process where source and target text are not put against one another, but they are merely moments in a process. Hence, initial semiotic systems and subsequent semiotic systems. And they themselves are not fixed points, but they are complexes in themselves that play out over time. So my idea was to say, okay, let us think about how we think about translation, and if we could think in terms of complexity and all the principles of complexity, which I will go into tomorrow's lecture, that might help us. So what complex adaptive systems tells us is that translation is not about stuff. Actually, very few scientific endeavors are about stuff. It's about the relations between stuff. So complexity theory moved the interest in explaining various things from physics through to what we do in translation studies to move the explanation from things like atoms to relations between things. And one could also say it's not about stuff, but about the organization of stuff, about how things are different because they are organized differently. So let me use an example. You can have carbon and combine it in certain ways, and then you have coal that you can use in a stove for a fire. Or you could organize the carbon molecules, atoms differently, and then you have graphite, and you can use that to write. So the difference isn't in the carbon, it's the same carbon that you use in different contexts. The difference is in the way that these things have been organized. And I think translation and meaning making, when we talk about translation, shares this, that it's not the stuff, it's not the words, it's not the essences, but it's the way in which relations are created and in which through which organization is created. So at that point, way back 2013, I really thought about translation in terms of these relations and the organization, having read a bit of Luhmann and Sergei Tyulenev's work. And I thought, so what are we doing when we translate? We are entering, we are mediating between different stuffs, between different things. We are mediating in such a way that new organizations and new relations are created. And at that point, I suggested that this would happen between different social and cultural systems. So when journalists talk to physicists, there would be a kind of entering needed in that interaction for new knowledge to be created out of that, the new social systems to be created. But then still the question is, so if we say what we do when we translate is mediating, entering, what is it that we are mediating? Between what are we mediating? If we say that translation is the work that relates and that organizes society and culture, it must be able to entail more than language, because societies and cultures grow out of more than mere language. I think language is pretty important, but it's not the only mode or medium through which societies and cultures emerge. So already at the end of the 2013 book, I started thinking seriously about semiotics. At some point, I thought I should withdraw the book from publication because it wasn't semiotically strong enough. But I thought, okay, I've done hard work on it, let me publish it and then start a new book. So thinking back now, I think that what happened between the 2013 and the 2018 books is the realization that epistemology only might not give us enough to work within translation studies. We also needed some kind of ontology. Now, I know this is a seriously contentious thing to say, and I've received criticism on it as well, but I still think that there is some truth about this, that when we deal with translation, we are not only dealing with ideas that float about immaterially, but we work with the matter and the energy around us, and we interpret that. So I started thinking, and semiotics gave me the tool, I think, to say, okay, semiotics is a place where idea and matter meet. And that's why I think, in addition to an epistemology, we need an onto epistemology. And I hope to be in good company here with the likes of Carlton Barrett and others. So again, the question is, what do we translate? In translation studies, there's been a number of answers, and I'm going to run through this quickly because I think you would all know them, right? So Jacobson would say, we translate language. The meaning of a linguistic science is translation into other science. And we have examples. These are only a few. There are many more. Would have said translation is about language. In the 90s, with the cultural turn, many scholars argued that what we are translating is culture, cultural relationships. After that, when applying sociology to translation, we say we're actually translating social relations, right? Translation is constrained by our social relations. Translation changes our social relations. But not everybody at that point would have said we are translating social relations. Maybe a Luhmann said it, but in translation studies, not everybody would necessarily have agreed. They would have said be more comfortable saying that translation constrains social relations or is constrained by, but we're not translating social relations, we're still translating language. In the ideology work that was done, Baker and people like Spivak, also Maria Timoshko, I've forgot to put her name in here, is sort of a focus. We look at the power relationships that are inscribed in translation, in a source text, and we try to translate, or at least maybe criticize the translation. As I was saying. So yes, so the movement was towards thinking of translation in terms of power. And then we can obviously mention the intention or Scopus theory action. We translate Scopoi. We don't translate particular sentences or particular words. We translate these larger intentions. So the problem for me with most of these answers was that they were still assuming that language is the stuff that gets translated. So it studied translation within a broader context. Yes, social context, cultural context, and it studied it from broader perspectives. Yes, ideology, politics, society. But the thing that was studied was still language. And you could see that in the examples that authors used. Even in sociological studies, many of them would still use the way in which a literary text influences a social system. So the thing that is being studied is still language and the literary use of language. So I think at least two things happened in the past 50 years that require of us to think broader about translation than translation as a linguistic activity. The one is technological advance. Since the rise of computational power, it has become much easier, much cheaper to communicate visually. With a printing press, visual communication was expensive, it was difficult. And so from the 1980s onwards, you get a visual turn where multimodal communication became the norm. And multimedia studies became a really important field of study. So the mere fact that I think texts today are mostly multimodal means that a translation theory that focuses on language only will not suffice to explain how our society works with meaning making and the construction and interpretation of meaning. I also think in the past 50 years, massive advances have been made in terms of what is known as biosemiotics, the understanding that it's not only human beings that make meaning, that it's not only human beings that use signs and interpret signs, but that all living organisms in various ways, and the detail of that is still quite debatable, but that living organisms make meaning. And use signs to make meaning. And therefore, the implication is translate. Because then if you move translation from a linguistic activity to a semiotic activity, then it means that non-linguistic living organisms also translate. So I think then that my understanding of the stuff that gets translated has grown into, it is semiosis, the process of meaning making that gets translated. So semiosis refers to this process where living organisms interpret the significance of what is around them. And that could be material, that could be ideational, that could be ideational materialized, like in How to Build a House, a plan, right? But I think the stuff that translation studies should be studying is semiotic processes, semiosis, which, as I said, means all living organisms and not only human organisms. Also, I think it opens quite a scope for studying the interrelations between humans and non-humans, and trying to make sense of other organisms on their own terms and not only in terms of our interests. Semiosis is therefore referring to all meaning-making systems. It refers to all living organisms, and it includes many more meaning-making systems than language. Language is only one of the meaning-making systems that one could study in a semiotic approach. So semiosis is this process through which we determine the significance or the relevance of anything that we encounter, any living organism encounters, right? If I encounter the projector in front of me, and those of you online won't be able to see it, but there's a projector projecting the screen. When I observe that, it is obviously a material thing there. And if I would run into it, my head would bump and I would have a serious blue blood clot in my head. But it's also a sign of technology, of communication across long distances. So semiotic processes isn't limited to any form. Whatever living organisms engage with, they do so through semiosis, through meaning-making processes. So the implications then would be that we translate all kinds of meaning, right? Not only linguistic meaning. We do so because meaning-making and the creation of meaning is a relationship between matter and energy, and the information that it contains for the moment, and the mind that interprets it. So we need to explain how bodies and minds engage with matter and energy and other minds and other ideas outside of them. So we need a kind of ontology, and I think the ontology that we need is the body of living organisms, which is the base in which this process takes place. Just a quick word on the relationship between translation and interpretation, because it's a fair question to ask. So if what you say, semiotic process, is a process of translation, what is interpretation then? And I think, for me, translation and interpretation are like the wave and particle functions of light. They are always both there, but you can only observe one at a time. Right? So you can go and read up about the observation of light. If you observe light, you either observe it as a wave or you observe it as a particle, but you can never observe it as both. Now, translation and interpreting has that kind of symbiotic relationship for me, where I think you only translate by interpreting and you only interpret by translating. So translation per se is it's creating a new sign out of a previous sign, right? The meaning of a sign is its translation into a new sign. That translation cannot happen without interpretation. It's always based, starting with a sign, translating it into another sign is based on an interpretation of what the first sign was and what it meant. But you could also not interpret without translating. The way to interpret a sign is to translate it into another sign. If I ask you what's the meaning of dog, and you say dog, it help me. You haven't contributed anything. You have to say it's a four-legged animal, blah, 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 right? So I think translation and interpreting picks out two, let's say, two sides of a coin, if I can put it that way, which both run together. So what I think is that we should move the interest of translation studies from language only to language and all other forms of meaning making. But now I've just moved the problem to meaning. So what now? Where do we get meaning? How do we get meaning? How does meaning work? And I think one of the answers is through interpreting the relevance of patterns of constraint. I will go into this a bit more, but that takes you into a kind of a cosmology. You now have to explain how the world fits together, because you want to explain how the material world around us, the ideational world that we as human beings have created, how these interface. And to explain that, you need to explain what you think the world is and what you think ideas are and what you think humans are. So if we generally start by asking the question, how do things in the universe come to be? How do things happen? What make things happen, or what make things be? Or we ask the question, how do humans fit into the universe as we know it? What is our ecological position in this world? Then we move the debate into a kind of an ecological debate, where we want to understand our place and also the place of the world. But to understand that, we then need to take another further step and say, what do we think is the way that things come about? I'm again quoting Piotr Blemczynski here, who had a beautiful formulation that expressed some of the ideas that I had. He says, events, occasions, and occurrences, and then in quotation marks, condition the formation of events, occasions, and occurrences that might follow. So the way in which things happen in the world could be explained in different ways. You could have a clearly atomistic explanation where things bump into another and then solidify and then create different things. But you could also look at the emergence of our world as a preparation happening kind of cycle, where certain things happen which create the conditions for further things to happen. if you just think about life, what was needed for life to happen? At least you needed cells, and you needed oxygen, and you needed sunlight, and you needed certain a bit of hydrogen, and you needed water, right? So what I think, if we think at a broader level, we can think about translation as a process that conditions and creates conditions for things to happen, and a process that works under these conditions and that are influenced by these conditions. So in two influential works, the one in 1999, the other one in 2023, Alicia Guerrero developed this theory of constraints, which is basically what Brzezinski referred to. And she defines constraints as entities or processes or events or relations or conditions, anything that raises or lowers the energy flow in a situation. So the point that I think I'm trying to make here is to say, if we want to understand translation in an ecological context, we need to understand how it plays into the flow of energy, the flow of action, the flow of how things become, and that is through energy. And if we want to understand how energy works, how work is created, we need to understand constraints. So it's a kind of a convoluted bit of a circular argument, right? So anything can act or function as a constraint, but the constraint itself doesn't transfer energy directly. It higher or lowers, it raises or lowers the flow of energy. And if we link information to energy, which has been done, it means that constraints also raise the flows of information and lowers the flows of information. And if we talk about information, it's a short step from there, talking about significance and meaning making as we see it in translation studies. So just quickly, there are context-independent constraints. Those would be the laws of physics that pretty much constrain everything everywhere in the same way. But then there are also context-dependent constraints. In other words, constraints which are created by a particular context. Constraints enabling, creating new things. For instance, if you have pressure on carbon, enough pressure, they become diamonds. It's the same stuff as graphite and coal, but it's now not, it's the same stuff, but it's not the same stuff. It's been constrained differently. And once things have been constrained differently, enabled, making them come to be, there are governing constraints which tend to keep them in existence. And I think especially in culture and societies that we work in, understanding what are the things that make things socially, culturally happening, and then understanding what are the constraints that keep them there are quite important to understand, because quite often the governing constraints are the ones that we would like to change because we think they've stagnated. Right. So the goal of constraints is to create differences in energy. And if you have differences in energy, things can happen. Things can be made. Things can be done. There are, in terms of physics, there are three types of ways in which things happen. The first is homeodynamics. That is just the natural way in which two systems work in on one another. So if water falls and it cools down, it becomes snow. It's the homeodynamic process. Morphodynamics is the forms of things, like in the form of an animal, the shape of an animal that stabilizes. And then teleodynamics is goal-directed work that is done. But to understand our societies and our cultures, I think we need to understand the role that ideas play in constraining the materiality of our societies and cultures. The interesting thing is that energy is something that works based on difference. Differences between two systems gives energy. But information is also something that works on differences. Something is only information if it's different from something else. If I write on the white wall behind me, which most of you can't see, with a white pen, there's no information because there's no difference. You have to have, for instance, color difference, sound difference to have information. And the same then works for significance. If there is no differences, there's no significance. So if we want to deal with significance, which is meaning and culture and the let's say the abstract, intentional kind of stuff that we want to deal with in cultural studies, we need to understand how this emerged from energy and information. This work has been done already. Gregory Bateson has said that any sign is a difference, in other words, a material kind of difference, that makes a difference, meaning that is significant. So the link between matter and significance has been made. And this means that signs do not have meaning, but they are material ideational constraints or sets of constraints that limits the possible meanings that can be deduced from them. If you close your eyes and don't see or hear anything, you can potentially think about anything. But if I show you a photo of a large dog, I limit the possible things that you can think of, well, that you would think of. You can still decide to think about other stuff, but typically, or if a large dog all of a sudden shows up at your door, you're not going to think, oh, this is a nice Shakespeare. Typically, that's not what you're going to think. So signs are material constraints that tend to limit the possibilities of what you can deduce or what you can infer from them. And the interesting point, I think, that Terence Deacon makes is that constraints can be replicated. In other words, constraints can be translated. You cannot translate meaning. You can only translate the constraints from a source or a source of information to another, in another format. The meaning needs to be interpreted. The meaning isn't just there. You haven't moved the meaning. You've just moved the sets of constraints with a hope, if you want to create a similar meaning, to create it, or with a hope of not creating a similar meaning if you don't want to create. So if you put black ink on a white page and you just smudge it, there's very little that you can translate out of that. You might be able to. But if you order the black ink on a white page in the convention of letters, there's much more information that could be interpreted from that. I'm not saying there's much more information in it. It's just there's a possibility of much more information that you can interpret. So my contention then, and should be shortly closing, my contention is that we do not translate language or culture or society or ideology or pragmatics. I would say that language, culture, society, ideology, pragmatics, the things that we translate, exist in the form of patterns of constraints on matter energy. Even in our brains, my flights of fantasy are patterns of chemistry and electricity in my brain. And even if I don't communicate it materially with anybody, if it's just there, it still has a particular material, physical constraint. So this means that what we describe as language, culture, society, or fair would be the shapes that we have given matter and energy based on our ideas, under the auspices of our ideas. And actually, I think when we say that we translate language, culture, etc., the concept there of culture is actually like a black box in Latour's definition. It's a shorthand for a massive conglomeration of matter, energy, idea linked together into one another. And I do think that thinking in terms of constraints provides us with a kind of a finer grail toolbox to unblack box the black boxes of translation theory. Not assuming cultures or societies, like Latour said, but constructing them and explaining them, and the micro work that is needed, also in and by our bodies, to do this work. So we translate, I think, our interpretation of the relevance or significance of the patterns of whatever we encounter. We perform semiotic work to interpret and to recreate what we have encountered. So the relevance or the significance of any sign then entails a complex of constraints that requires consideration in the translation process. And this was already suggested in the 1990s by Peter Torp, the Estonian colleague, who said that translation is a process that at the same time deals with these many stuffs, if I can refer back to my topic. So to close, I suppose it would be fair to ask, why go to all this trouble? I remember Sandra Halverson, the Norwegian scholar that I have real respect for, wrote a review of the 2013 book, the Complexity book, and she said, well, this gives an interesting overview of the domain in which translation studies happen. And it would be important if it was important to know the domain. And she said that's an open question. Do we need to understand all of this to understand translation? Was basically a question. And I think it's a fair question. Back then, I didn't have an answer at all. Now I think my answer would be that we need, from a complexity perspective, we need both detailed answers and larger perspective answers. We need to zoom in into detail and zoom out to see the larger patterns. We need to see the wood and the trees and the wood. And I think that translation studies tend to focus more on the trees, if I may be so bold, and too little on the wood. And maybe that's also a good thing, because we don't just want idealist constructions. We want to have empirical work too. But so the question is, why do I go all the way of trying to not only suggest what translation should be epistemologically, ontologically, but also in terms of a cosmology, how we fit into the universe? And obviously, as I said, it is because of the technological and scholarly advances, but my main reason is because of the ecological issues that we have. I think it's important to situate translation studies within the ecology of our existence. I think there are probably still too much of translation studies that think that translation is merely about ideas. And I mean, I know that in cognitive translation studies, much of this has been sort of overcome, but there are still, I think, a lot going around which says, well, we're actually just dealing with ideas, with high cultures, with the movement of ideas between places, in a way that's not deeply ecological and perhaps with ecological sensitivity, but I don't think necessarily with a deep conceptual underbelly. So I think a translation study is based in biosemiotics, in other words, meaning-making processes in all living organisms, should be able to account for all these processes. And I do think, by the way, that as we enter the AI crisis, as some would call it, the translation studies that's able to train people to deal with animal communication, to deal with ecological issues, might be actually a really worthwhile translation studies, because those are the things that we need to deal with in order to move forward as a species. I think a translation study is based in biosemiosis can account for the materiality of semiosis, the embodiedness of meaning making. I was interested in reading in the abstracts of it was the abstracts of the EST conference, quite a bit of work being done on infrastructure and how that relates to translational processes. And I think that is a really interesting move to think about the materiality of what we do in translation studies. And then obviously in gender studies, this has been used quite a lot. So I think translation studies based on a complexity logic, based in biosemiotics, can account for the paradoxes of existence, one of which is life, which requires another one, translation. Thank you. Ooh, this is now moved. Thank you very much.
The camera. Thank you, Cobus. We have plenty of time for questions. We have about a half hour at least for questions. There we have Lisa is monitoring the chat, so if you would like to write your question in the chat, that's possible. Yeah, let's stop sharing. Actually, we can pull up the wonderful. Now we can see faces. So for those of you who would like to turn your cameras on, please do so now. Know that the recording is still going as we discussed this morning, but it would be lovely to see some faces. We can see you now, and the people in the room here can also see you. So as I mentioned, we now have time for questions, and we'll go around with the microphone here. Cobus, if you could restate the question if it comes from the audience here. Otherwise, we can hear you normally in the chat. So let's open the question round. And as you're thinking of questions, I get to misuse my place here and ask the first question, if you don't mind. How would one begin to visualize systems of constraints? Would it even be helpful to if the core concept is translation is the study of systems of constraints, would it even be helpful to visualize those systems of constraints? And if so, how would that look? How would you go about visualizing the concept?
I don't know. That's why I want to attend the session on visualizing qualitative data in the
With Philip, yeah.
Yes. So I think well, in terms of languages, I think our knowledge of syntax and morphology and the way that you can structure, if you want to use Chomskyan grammar, you can structure how a sentence works, and you can read that as a pattern of constraint that you could then say, okay, what could I do with that? when it comes to intersemiotic translation, I think it's much more difficult because as we discussed this afternoon, we don't have sufficient vocabulary at this point to describe and sufficient categories to describe how intersemiotic translations take place. With language, you can say, okay, let's take syntactical structure as a point of comparison. What do you take as a point of comparison when you study the translation of a painting into a poem or a painting into a piece of music, right? So working on that, I think, is still quite a bit of work to be done. And then I would say in terms of visualizing, and this is very basic, because I haven't thought I've thought a bit about visualizing, but mostly not. One of the things that I do is I would just sketch out relations between constraints that I think might be relevant and kind of draw little diagrams of them. But no, I will still have to learn. I can't really give you a good answer. What I have done for the EST conference in 2019 is I've asked the graphic designer to create animated versions of translation processes, and translation motive animated as a flow of water process, an aeroplane flying, and electromagnetic systems. So that's just to give the sense of movement and the sense of process. But no, I think there's a lot of work to be done on this. And except for rough drawings, I have no other rough diagrams. I have no other comment on that.
I wonder if it has something to do with describing and qualifying constraint types. For example, if you take the concrete empiric situation of trying to understand dolphin-to-dolphin communication as a human, if you can describe the different qualities and of certain types of constraints and visualize it in a way that accounts as well as possible for constraints on both sides of that of the species divide, you might say, then somehow matching them together, you could probably identify common constraints and uncommon constraints like sonar or whatever. And in that way, in some visual form, you could maybe find common constraints that could account for a new form of interspecies translation. But as you mentioned, I think we need more.
Yeah.
We need more tools.
I think the problem probably is that purely describing the material constraints of a certain situation would not be too difficult, except for a number of things, such as what determines what you observe, right? So when we observe human language, we kind of know what to observe that would give us the best possible interpretation. But probably one of the first things with animal communication is to figure out what of those constraints are significant, and then the second question becomes, in what way are they significant? Because if you don't do that, the danger is anthropocentrism, where you just interpret them from what you know.
Yeah.
So the engagement. So a lot of my work recently is also about the engagement with the other. Animals. Just to give you an example, after the movie My Octopus Teacher was made in South Africa, everybody in the world stopped eating octopus because now octopus have feelings. Now, that's all fine, but if we cannot respect octopuses, whether they have feelings or not, it doesn't really help us with the ecological perspective, right? Because some people eat people, right? And some people kill people easier than they would kill an octopus, right? So the raising the standard of the emotional existence of an other is for me a very anthropocentric thing to do. And if you, what I think, what translation studies teaches us is to allow the other to remain other, interpret that in a way that makes sense for another other, right? And I think that is something that we can work on. In that kind of expertise or mindset is what we could work on with when it comes to animal communication.
Thank you. Yes, Celia. Do we need a microphone or can we?
You? I'm not sure. Otherwise, you can come and stand here. It's a short way. Just stand here.
Thank you very much. Wonderful lecture. I had a question for a while, and I wanted to pick up on these constraints that you were talking about. It was fascinating when you were talking about how these constraints actually help us to determine meaning or engage in the semiosis, the meaning-making process. I was thinking that it reminds me of something a lot. What it reminds me is the good old thought of Russian formalists that said, well, okay, that's the form that actually determines meaning, etc., etc. But then you have this very, very serious, and also it has to do with how do you choose the constraints and whether which constraints do you choose in order to analyze specific phenomena. And so yes, form determines the meaning, the good old idea of Russian formalists, but there is this paradox that we ask ourselves the question, well, what is form then? Whether or not it has some meaning to itself. It is a paradoxical situation. So my question is, what is this constraint? What is it made of? And what meaning does it have to itself? Because if it's not a linguistic kind of situation that constrains, it must be some kind of something else. But here is the problem, is that we bring meaning and bring language to everything out there. And this constraint that should be ideally a completely formalistic notion becomes meaningful straight away, right?
Right. So I'm going to probably use this example a lot. But this is an example that I got from Kalevi Kuhl, the famous biosemiotician from Luke's part of the world. So if I show you where, let me just see where I can show. Yes, now everybody can see. If I show you my finger, then we can describe this finger in a material way very clearly. So it is 10 centimeters long, it's so much in circumference. It is pinkish, whitish, I don't know what color it is. It has sinews, which you can describe. It has bones. It has a weight. So you can describe this thing materially perfectly. At the same time, if I do this with my finger, it doesn't stop being my finger. It is still my finger, and all its features are still there. But paradoxically, at the same time, it's also now a sign of pointing to somebody, right? Pointing to whoever, right? And I wouldn't even use the middle finger because that's another very interesting sign that I could create, but not in good company like this. So I'm using this to answer your question. I think the formalists, from my very humble perspective, was wrong when they said form determines meaning. Form constrains possible meanings, right? And therefore, I would say there is no meaning in form. Form is a material or conceptual existence into which you enter in a semiotic relationship. and you determine the meaning. Obviously, then, it's difficult to say what is the right meaning. And in the 90s, Umberto Eco already said, we cannot determine the right meaning, especially of literary texts, but we can determine wrong meanings. So it's kind of a negative view. So if I point to Peter and you ask, are you talking to me? I could say, no, you're wrong. Your interpretation is wrong. Right? So the meaning isn't in the finger. The finger in relation, organized in a certain way, gets the function of meaning made. Right? So it's a combination. I think semiosis gives us a combination of the constraints, but also the interpretation of constraints. The meaning isn't in the constraint. The constraint suggests certain possible meanings. And as we know, looking at paintings, you cannot say which meaning. Even looking at one another, that might be Heidi's friendly face, or it might be her sleepy face, and I don't know. Right? I have to interpret it. So yes, so I think I wouldn't say that form determines meaning. I would say form constrains it, and that's why I specifically use the term constrain, because it means it limits the flow, or it directs actually the flow of energy by focusing me on a certain thing to think, which will hopefully then lead to further actions and so on. So it's never a deterministic thing. There's always an interpretation. That's why I spoke about translation and interpretation, because translation can quite often be understood deterministically, right? You have an A here and you have an A here, or you have with Morse code, you have 2 dots here and you have 2 dots here. But translation is always based on an interpretation. Does that make some kind of sense? What they are made of, they are just the material things. So just to answer, to get to the online audience, the question is what the constraints are made of, right? So constraints could be physical things. The rows of chairs in this room, this venue, constrain you to sit one behind the other. It doesn't, if there was a circular organization of chairs, the constraints would be different, and therefore the meaning of this interaction would in some way be different. Because now it's me in front, you sitting, and especially if you were students, then you have to pay attention very carefully, because I can ask questions and then you may look embarrassed. Right? So while if there was a round table venue, then I am just one of the round table. Right? So there's the constraints are anything material. The constraints are also paradoxically things that did not happen. And this reminds me of the other thing I wanted to say. But yeah, so because I did not water my plant died. What I did not do was a constraint on that plant, which had a certain effect. I think ideas can be constraints. So I have the idea, I've been raised with it, that I should respect people when they ask questions after a lecture. So I structure my response to you under the auspices of that idea. That idea is a constraint which makes my tone of voice not right, but a reasonable kind of engagement, right? Yeah, it could also be, I think, social and cultural habits, and the things that are studied in cultural studies and in sociology. Conventions on how to greet elders. It's an idea that structure your physical material way your body acts. Right. What I also wanted to say here is just what you made me think of is that, and it also makes me think of what Jack asked. One of the interesting ways to deal with constraints and their implications is by using counter argumentation, right? So if you want to understand, are these chairs relevant? Are they a constraint? Or are they not? And your argument is, were they set in a round circle, would the interaction have been different? So you kind of construct counter arguments to determine the importance of a particular kind of constraint. And physically, I haven't figured out how to visualize that, but it's something that I quite often use, is to play that kind of a counter-argumentative game. And you can also obviously counter arguments this has been argued philosophically. Some are stronger than others, right? So where the chair is upside down, it would have had a greater influence than they were in a circle, right? So the upside down chairs have a greater constraint on a class than chairs in lines. Are there questions? I don't. Frans. Welcome, Frans.
Yes, hello, Cobus, and thanks for your lecture. I'd like to touch on a point that you strongly made in your talk and that has resurfaced just a minute ago about translation always involving interpretation or interpreting and the other way around. And as someone specializing in interpreting with some other colleagues, we're aware that in the mid-1980s, this early group of scholars working on interpreting around Danica Seleskovic in Paris made this point very explicitly. They even published a book in 1984 entitled Interpréter pour traduire, always playing on that double meaning, not translation in that sense, but conference interpreting, but interpreting through interpretation and the other way around. And my question would simply be, in the development of translation studies, how do you view the continuity, if any, of this kind of thinking in the leading to the current consensus that translation without interpretation isn't possible, in which translation also involves the more specific mode of interpreting, as in conference interpreting?
Thanks, Frans. So firstly, I think that what I'm trying to do, yes, builds on a very long line of thinking. Not only these French scholars you've spoken about. I mean, they still have a newsletter going out every month or so about, I think, the hermeneutics of interpreting or something. But also people like Steiner, is it George Steiner? In the 80s, Umberto Eco in the 90s has written a lot about translation and interpretation. Currently, people like Douglas Robinson would basically all his work is done on hermeneutics. So I think there's definitely this line of hermeneutic thinking in translation studies. I think it's sometimes, and yeah, you're probably going to stone me for this in the public square, but it's sometimes more assumed than studied, if I might say so. That's why I talked about the black box. the hermeneutic process, I think, is cognitive, from the cognitive neuro perspective, obviously still a black box, but also we tend to assume that few people would say it doesn't happen, but I think very few, I'm saying this too strongly. Let me put it positively. I don't think there's enough studies that focus on this. And then particularly, I think, with the materialist turn and the materialist biological turn that we are seeing, where we need to rethink our existence within an ecology, I think we can have stronger conceptualizations. In terms of interpreting studies itself, it's difficult for me to answer you because I don't work in that. But for me, interpreting as a professional activity, or even if you do it as a lay activity, I have not seen examples where it would follow different where it would follow different patterns from what is generally described in semiotics. It is a semiotic process of translating words into other words, or if you do sign language interpreting, gestures into other, or visual signs, not gestures, visual signs into other visual signs. So maybe I didn't get your question that clearly, but for me, interpreting as a professional activity is one of the modes of semiosis that we can study. And actually, what I also, and maybe I'm here stepping on toes again, but I listened in 2010, I think it was Moira Ingeleri who had a fantastic lecture about the color red. And interpreting, it was in Manchester, a conference that Mona Baker organized. And how to interpret red. And I think she used that exactly to say that the interpreting process is more than just linguistic interpretation. It's an embodied material form of interpretation also. And I think one could further study that under this kind of way of thinking. I hope I answered, but if not, you're welcome to come back.
Yes, no, yes, thank you. Maybe it's also interpreting involving a different set of constraints, to use your terminology. It is a form of translation, it involves interpretation, but it probably involves a typical pattern of constraints compared to, let's say, audiovisual translation or inter-semiotic translation.
Yeah, you said it much better than I could. That's exactly it. And that's why I think what we call, so thanks, you make actually an important point. So I think that all these processes that we study in the emergence of cultures and in how communication and meaning making works in cultures, I think they all are based on the same premise. And that is what Peirce said, the meaning of a sign is its translation into another sign. They all, you can, in every one of them, you can find that kind of description. Where the difference comes is in the constraints operative on that process, right? So if the constraints are that, let's say with a constitution, we want the target text to be an exact copy of the source text. We can do that. You just have politicians put a stamp on it saying this is an exact copy, and then it's done. So you put a political constraint on that text, and no matter how much a translation studies scholar will say it's not exactly the same, for the political purposes, it's the same thing. It's a set of constraints that you impose on that text. So thanks. Yes, I take your point fully. I agree fully. Yeah. Oh. Glad that he's online and not here. There's Jose also. Hello, Jose.
Ne bileyim olay gene ona geldi.
Okay, so Peng, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Hi, Cobus, I have a question. As you mentioned that semiosis is an ever-developing process, and in this context, translation can be ideally an endless meaning-making and meaning-taking process. However, if we are about to study a specific translation case or process or practice, we have to cut the ever-developing flow or line of semiosis and focus on a line segment of the meaning-making and the meaning-taking process. And in this case, when we take constraints into consideration, constraints participate in a cognitive activity to help us produce meaning. So does this suggest that when we think about biosemiosis, it will be better to have at least one human being as either the speaker or the recipient of meaning or meaning discover? Otherwise, if there is no human being involved, will meaning be meaningless in this case?
Okay. So are you asking that, saying that if two animals or two species of animal, interspecies communication, if that happens, whether there's meaning involved in that, or that meaning can only happen between a human and an animal? I'm not exactly sure what you asked.
So I'm thinking that constraints, when it's about meaning construction, it participates in a kind of cognitive activity of human being, so that we as human being can meaning making or meaning taking. But if we consider like a translation process that only involves like animals or one animal and another matter which has no like lives or death, then in this sense, how do we access that meaning? So in this case, do you think that human being is necessary in this process?
I would say this process is again only different from interlingual translation in the sense of the constraints that operate on it. In interlingual translation, what somebody says can be as foreign and as difficult to decipher. And anybody who has been married will know that, right? How often you get it wrong. Something very simple. So I would say, okay, so we have to, so that was just a very simple remark to give me time to think. What we need to distinguish is between others making meaning, and they can do that without us. When a lion cub and another lion cub interacts, they do so in a meaningful way that's meaningful for them, and they don't need humans to be involved in that process to make it meaningful. If baboons in a troop interact in certain ways with certain social structures, they act in meaningful ways without human beings' involvement. So I don't think for the animals, they need humans to make meaning, to have meaningful interactions. Obviously, when we want to understand what the animals are doing, then we come in as an observer of the sign processes between animals, and there it becomes difficult to, like I said when Jack asked, it becomes difficult to understand what is meaningful in what they are doing now, right? And that is what I think the biological sciences and ecological science and things are doing to help us figure out what happens there, because we just don't know. It is as if you are in a meeting where everybody speaks Russian and you only speak Dutch. what is important, right? And for humans, we can still assume certain similarities because we belong to a similar species. So we would assume that if they smile, they're happy. But if baboons smile, they might be angry. You know, they might be baring their teeth, you know, so you can't take it on face value. So I would say communication between living organisms, or meaning making, not communication, meaning making between living organisms take place without humans. And I also think, which is a really difficult concept to grasp, is that it takes place without central nervous systems. Like in plants, you would have certain interactions and there's no central nervous system. So it's not thinking, it's not cognitive within, it's semiotic, it's a form of meaning making. That difference is something that I'm still playing with and trying to understand. Yeah, so I hope that is sort of answered.
Oh, yes, thank you.
There was somebody else also, was it Elisa? Oh, sorry. You look differently, man. Sorry. There's a question here from the floor, Luke.
Join you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Cobus. Very interesting as an introduction, I think, for your whole complex way of thinking. It was very often, and also in the questions, it was very often about two, well, absolute evergreens when thinking about translation. That is language and meaning, of course. We talked about language and meaning long before there was translation studies. We, that is human beings. And I'm not sure I completely agree the way you presented it, that in translation studies, most scholars are still dealing with language, you said, with linguistic approaches. I think it is much more complex than that, much more complicated, because I see over the past decades a huge variety of approaches, also distinguishing between verbal language, visual language, and so on. And all these approaches, I think, rely on a concept that was not mentioned, and that is representation. Language, verbal language, visual language, and other ways of representing reality, society, culture, whatever. That is how researchers nowadays in translation studies, I think, approach translation, which is a different way than how it was talked about 60 or 70 years ago. So my question to you would be, what is the use, the value of the concept of representation in your way of looking at translation and constructing meaning?
Thanks. That is indeed a difficult question. Jack and I touched on it over lunch this afternoon, but it is a massive question. And I will, on the one hand, my insight in it would be limited, and on the other hand, time is also running out. So I would say that, I mean, in all of my understanding, in all of the humanities, cultural studies, representation has become a difficult term. And some people would not even use it. I know that in our university in cultural studies, they would not use the term representation. It's a swear word for them. I think that there is enough evidence that semiotic systems allow us certain representations. As long as you consider those representations as emergent, being made, and not underlying structures, you know, getting back to structuralism. If you consider them as historically being made under particular conditions, then I still think there is some use to representation. There is the other side of representation. So in Peircean theory, I told Jack this often, it's not clear when Peirce wrote about semiosis whether he meant representation or mediation. And the tendency now is towards mediation as a more fruitful interpretation of what happens in meaning making, rather than representation. Because with representation, you always assume some kind of consciousness, while with mediation, you don't have to assume consciousness. I mean, something without a central nervous system could not really have a representation of anything, but there could be mediation. That would be the biological argument, I think. So I think this is a really difficult question. I think the theoretical framework that I use would allow for both. But it would focus on the representation as a process emerging under historical constraints, under historical conditions, and not as something set. In terms of the field of study, yeah, I mean, we can always differ in our interpretations, I think. And I fully agree with you that obviously the last 15, 20 years has seen a massive change. But if you look at, let's say, just two leading scholars like Venuti, Douglas Robinson, Anthony Pym, they pretty much do language. And they would, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that there are still serious scholars who focus their work on language and would not really be well, and does so from an anthropocentric perspective. Would not, I mean, somebody like Douglas Robinson is not interested in what animals contribute to anything, which is fine and fair. I don't think it's a point of criticism. I think I'm just using it as to say why I do say that I think there is still a way to go. I mean, obviously, the field will have to decide for itself. If you take complex adaptive systems as a theory and you apply it to translation studies, the field will have to decide for themselves whether the kind of nonsense that I'm talking is worthwhile. And I don't assume that it is. I think the field will take it, or it will die off. And there's a good chance that it will die off. And then you will be right and I was wrong. Might be the other way around.
The question, because you know that the talk of working with colleagues of semiotics on in translation, city translation, which are very different types of translation, and they use the concept of representation and representational value of language, and that fits very well into what you were saying. Representation.
I'm not. Just for the people online, Luc van Doorselaar said that where he works in Tartu, the semioticians use representation a lot, and he thinks it's a key concept. I love my colleagues in Tartu, but I do disagree with them on that score. I think so they've been heavily influenced by Lotman. And I think there are a few glitches in Lotman's thought. One of them is, I think, over-reliance on interpretation. On representation, sorry. He kind of, so he talked about modeling systems, culture as a modeling system. And I think, as I said, there is value in it, but I think they, for my liking, they overreach, I think, a bit in terms of the focus on the representation rather than mediation. I also, for instance, when I read somebody like Kalevi Kuhl, when he writes about translation in animal work, he assumes a kind of a stable process, right? There's a source text and it must be the same in the target text. So I think every tradition has their ways of looking at things. And I agree, the presentation is valuable, but I wouldn't make that the be all and the end all. But maybe I'm wrong.
Changes the concept
It changes.
of language, how you approach language.
Whether you see it as a representation or not.
That's why I give examples. It's much more. That was what we're mainly referring to.
So I'm not getting your point, but we can take it up over a glass of wine.
Okay, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Cobus for an excellent first lecture.